Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. Starting early next year, under the SkillsFuture Level-Up Programme, mid-career workers aged 40 and above who are enrolled in part-time training will get a fixed allowance of 300 Singapore dollars a month to help defray their learning expenses.
Yep, and what will also be enhanced is the Workfare Skills Support scheme targeted at lower-wage workers to provide them with longer-form courses that provide more substantive reskilling and upskilling. Now, these are part of a slew of measures announced at the recent Budget 2025 and are part of the government's efforts to encourage lifelong learning.
But the one lingering question on many people's minds, will I earn more after upskilling? Well, to hopefully help us answer that, we're joined by Walter Theseira, Associate Professor, Economics Programme at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Good morning, Walter.
Hey, good morning.
Yeah, nice to have you on. Now, many employees would wonder, will I get a pay raise after all this upskilling and retraining? What's the real opportunity cost here? And is that a fair question to be asking of your employers?
You know, this is a great question, probably the most important one, right? What's the economic return to training? But it's actually also a very difficult question to answer. So what we do know is that there are very clear gains to earnings from pre-employment training. So, you know, that's things like polytechnic, university, and so on. So there's very clear evidence there that higher educated workers get paid better on average. And, you know, even within a particular tier of education, there are pretty big differences in terms of what kind of program you're in. So more tech-oriented, more business-oriented programs have been earning more recently. But the picture is actually less clear for adult training, you know, for people who are already in the workforce. And that's because there are so many different kinds of training and so many different kinds of workers go for it. So I want to draw a distinction here between what you might call employer-supported training and self-directed training. So employer-supported, that's when your employer sends you for the course and so on, and that will generally have productivity or capability gains. And so you see for that, employers will pay for the training, they give you time off. But in return for that, they also want to get value from you as a worker. So, you know, they typically want to split the gain. So they may not necessarily raise your wages right away. For self-directed training, that's when workers basically ask for time off and then go and look for a course themselves or maybe do it in between jobs and things like that. And, you know, people do that because they want to take those skills and look for a better job or better opportunities. But then it's actually much harder for the workers to find training of good market value. So that's really a big challenge. Right? How do they find a course which will actually improve their prospects as opposed to employer-supported training where the employer is sending you for it because it will definitely improve your productivity. So that's a big challenge right now.
So you explained the difference between employer versus self-directed training. I do want to focus a little bit more on the self-directed training here. So when it comes to deciding whether to pursue this extra training, what should workers be considering? You know, how do they weigh the time commitment, the financial costs, and the potential rewards of upskilling here?
So, you know, there's actually been a lot of studies on this. We've also done a study on this recently with focus group discussions on workers considering training. And what we find is workers are obviously very careful about looking at the cost and benefits of training. When they look at the courses, they look at how credible the course provider is, whether there are qualifications or certificates which are recognized, also whether they've got the time, you know, and ability to actually succeed in the course. And they look at career prospects very carefully as well. They try to figure out, is this course going to lead me to a better job opportunity, you know? But I would say that making this decision is actually very difficult for workers. They tell us that it's very hard for them to get good information on the courses, on credibility. It's hard for them to figure out, you know, does this actually give you better prospects? What we find is that there are, of course, information sources out there. If you go to SkillsFuture, you know, there's so much information on the website there for you. But the workers are telling us it's hard for them to understand this. So that's a real challenge.
Walter, if we go back to the allowance provided by the government to workers who decide to enroll for further training, how significant do you think this financial support is in encouraging mid-career workers to pursue upskilling opportunities?
So I think the context for this is that we already have a skills training landscape where there's a lot of support by government for course fees. But here, I think what's really important is the newer support that's been announced, and that is in the area of training allowances. That's because mid-career workers usually have a lot of financial obligations. They are supporting their families. So even though the course fees may be subsidized, they will find that the most important cost is the opportunity cost, especially if they want to go for a long-form course. That typically means either taking, for example, no pay leave, or maybe they do it in a career break, so they're not, earning substantial income during that time, or perhaps no income. So the training allowance is going to be key, even if it's just a part-time training allowance because they are, doing the training in the evening and so on. It's still useful because they have got additional costs they may need to incur, for example, having to buy food out or, take transport, private transport and so on to get to the course in time. So it's also useful to look at another piece of support, which is the SkillsFuture Job Seeker Support. And people get that if they are retrenched. That's really important because, of course, nobody wants to be retrenched. But if you are, you need that cushion to think about, is retraining, better for you than just immediately looking for a job, which may not be as good.
All right, Walter, we talked about, the time commitment, the financial costs. You also brought up the lack of information. So these are some of the biggest challenges I imagine workers face when it comes to taking up further training, especially mid-career professionals. What else do you think needs to be done then to support this group?
Well, again, when we talk to the workers, I think besides all of the difficulty in thinking about what course to take, they also report time. Time is one of the biggest challenges. And we see workers tell us that they cannot get time off from work and family obligations to go for training. And, that's especially if it's self-directed, because it's one thing if the employer is telling you to go for it, then they give you the time and so on. But if you decide for yourself that this would improve your skills, you have to ask your employer to, give you time off, or you have to take your personal leave, and people just don't have that kind of time to spare. We also find, besides time costs, that workers also report some, you might say, psychological barriers, and that relates to how, when you think about a course which is more challenging, maybe the course of a test or exam, they realize, it's been years in some cases, since they took a formal test or something. And people are worried that they might spend time and effort in the course, and then they cannot pass the test. They can't get the qualification. But, from the perspective of a trainer as well, right, because universities are doing this training for adult workers, it's also a problem for us because if we remove all assessment and so on, then we cannot assure that the learning is done, and we can't assure that then the course will not be credible. So it's a bit of a challenge we have to work through.
Yeah, it's a fair point, Walter. A bit of an economics 101 term here, Gini coefficient. So Singapore's Gini coefficient in 2024, which is, again, a statistical measure of economic inequality in a population, fell to a record low of 0.364. And that marked a significant milestone in efforts to reduce income inequality. Obviously, a lower Gini index indicating less inequality. So with regards to upskilling and retraining, what kind of effects might we see on this front in the medium to long term?
So I think first I want to point out that the number that we talked about there is actually post-taxes and transfers. That means that's a measure of the Gini coefficient in Singapore after the government has already, implemented policies to redistribute to help, lift up lower wage Singaporeans and so on. But of course, the inequality number is going to be affected by the distribution of skills and job structure in Singapore. I mean, one of the reasons why you've got higher inequality, for example, in a city like Singapore, right, is that we've got a pretty large gap between the top earners in Singapore and everyone else. And that's because, Singapore is a global talent capital, it's a global business capital, and that means that we do have a substantial chunk of extremely high skill, extremely high earning workers in Singapore, and there's going to be a gap there, and that drives inequality. So I think the key here with upskilling and retraining is that we actually want to level up the broad mass of Singaporean workers. But I think there's going to be a challenge there, which is that even as we do that, even if we offer more opportunities for the broad mass in Singapore to get more skills and higher earnings, there will also be a number of Singaporeans who benefit especially, right? Because they've got the skills or talent and capability to get those top jobs. And so as their earnings keep going up, that also works against inequality going down. But, overall, of course, the objective, I think, of retraining and so on is to make sure that the broad mass of Singaporeans do have better skills and earnings.
So speaking of this broad mass, we've seen a lot of changes in the workforce in general and the evolution of jobs. So are there any particular sectors that you think stand to benefit the most from workers continually upgrading their skills?
That's a great question. But I would say that, there's actually not a very long list of jobs which will not benefit from upskilling or training. It's actually that almost every job would benefit from this. And the reason why I say this is that technology and the ways that you do your job, that's changed tremendously over time. So there's been a study done by U.S. economists, David Otto and others, and they found that in the U.S., more than half of the jobs that exist today did not, in fact, exist in 1940. So there's been huge job market change over time. World Economic Forum estimated recently that about a quarter of jobs will actually churn. So that means that new jobs will get added and old jobs get removed. And a quarter of jobs may churn, according to them, over the rest of this decade. So the job market is actually changing whether we like it or not. I don't think this means there's going to be mass unemployment, right? So one shouldn't worry that just because a lot of jobs have changed, you're going to lose your job. But what it means is that the way you used to do your job before, that may not be the same way that you do it in a decade or two. It may not be a completely new job, but there'll be new technologies, processes you have to use, and that's why I would say continuous upskilling is necessary for everybody, and it's not just something that other people do,
Right, Walter, I've got a couple of questions to close out. So businesses, too, need to play their part. The first question is, what kind of support or incentives would encourage businesses to invest more in the continuous learning of their workforce? And the second one is, we know that upskilling and retraining helps organizations with their retention and talent acquisition objectives. But how can they guard against employees who perhaps may decide to upskill and then perhaps leave an organization shortly after completing said training?
So I think, when you look at the workers again, and that's, I think, really important because we're talking about businesses, but if the workers don't want to do the training, right, then the businesses can't do anything. So when we look at workers, they complain that they cannot get time to train. That's a major issue they have. And I think from the businesses, of course, the reason why that happens is that the employers say they cannot spare their staff any time. And this is very understandable because Singapore businesses run very lean, This is a high-cost business environment, high productivity. You need to run your business with as few staff or manpower as possible. And it's also a more general problem, and it goes beyond training time. We know that Singapore business reports difficulty coping with other kinds of mandated absences, like maternity or paternity leave or NS obligations. And I think there's a broader question, how do we support businesses to handle these kinds of manpower disruptions? There are already financial grants, of course, for training and so on, but can we help businesses tap on part-time manpower more effectively to fill in for all these kinds of disruptions? Basically, I think training should be win-win for the workers and for the business. And that's because workers get better job prospects, but the business also gets better skilled workers. But, as you asked earlier, right, businesses do fear that when the workers get better skilled, the workers are going to leave. So I think that's where, of course, beyond just the usual tools like, businesses asking workers to sign, bonds and so on if they go for employer-sponsored training, I think businesses do have to look at themselves and they have to ask, how do I actually share the gains of productivity, training, and so on better with the employees, right? So it's not just about, exploiting workers after you train them and getting more productivity. It's also about making sure that they're recognized for the additional productivity and gains they bring to the workplace. And it's also about how we, help businesses, structure how they operate so that they can activate these win-wins more, right? So that it's the routine that your workers go for training rather than the exception, as some businesses think it should be today.
All right. Well, some great insights that helped us break down how upskilling could not only boost individual careers, but also contribute to a more inclusive economy. Walter, thanks again for joining us this morning. Always great chatting with you.
Thank you.
Yep, you just heard from Walter Theseira, Associate Professor, Economics Program at Singapore University of Social Sciences. This is Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.